So welcome everyone to Drisha's fall program. And this is the second out of a 4-part series on living and dying with dignity, themes in Halakhah and medical decision making with Rabbi Daniel Reifman. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rabbi Reifman.
Okay. When we last left our heroes, we were talking about who was our hero of the story of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's maid. And we suggested that it was in fact her who is the hero of the story, and therefore the character whose behavior becomes a paradigm for further legal decision making. Let me say that again. When you have a story that's situated within a legal context, there's a natural question that you have to ask, which is, how do I translate from the language of a story to the language of law? What's the difference between the language of story and the language of law? We talked about this a little bit, but let me just see how much you got, and if you have and then we can push forward. What's the difference between when I say the language of a story, I mean, what do I mean? This technical term, the poetics of a story, the way that the author of a story uses the devices of text, of drama, could be drama, to create a sense of a story, of a plot, of a narrative, of character. All that is very different than a legal context in which a judge creates a sense of law instead of drama, in which a legislator crafts a legal text as opposed to a story. What's the key difference then between the language of a story, or the discourse of story, and the discourse of law? I mean, there are a lot of differences, but when we think about translating from one to the other, what do we have to do? Yeah, Michelle, go ahead.
You need to make it into a code.
You need to make it a code. And what's the difference between the tone of a story and the tone of a code?
Well, a story is a narrative that has a person, it's lodges in a personal interaction. It has the feeling connotation. There's a once upon a time, and then it ends. So it's limited to that. It's seemingly limited to that interaction.
Okay, there's a very limited time frame. The story is about Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, his maid, the rabbis. It takes place at one point in time, at one historical context. And who's to say it has anything to do with our lives? You have to turn it into a code, which necessitates, on the one hand, extrapolating and abstracting and generalizing from her behavior to anybody's behavior. That's one of the tricky things that we're going to get to. How do you do that extrapolation? You can do it, of course, in many different ways. What is it about her behavior that is important, what's the takeaway from the story, right? That's the process of translating from the language of story to the language of law. In a story also, you have multiple registers. We talked about the fact there are multiple characters in the story, and therefore in the story, you could pick any one character and say, oh, their behavior is the one that I find to be upstanding, to be praiseworthy, to be something that I want to turn into normative behavior, right? You could have picked anybody. You could have picked the rabbis, you could have picked the angels, but we picked her. We picked Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's maid as the person whose behavior is most representative of the behavior that we want to become normative, okay? That's as far as the story went. We also talked about the different values that are in play, both in the story and more broadly in terms of these life and death or end-of-life issues, and we listed 4 of them. And I'm just going to use the whiteboard again because I want to actually kind of rearrange them for today's class, and hopefully this will be the final way that we present them. Let's share a whiteboard, and let's do the following. Again, we talked about 4 different elements or 4 different values that come up in these sorts of end of life care discussions. And I'm hoping this will cooperate with me this time. There we go. Okay. We said we have in one corner suffering. We said we had, so let's put suffering. Let me move suffering over here. I think suffering should be the first thing we put on the board. The first thing that we put on the board should be life. Then we have suffering, which we said really breaks down into two separate issues. Suffering can be mental anguish, or it can be physical pain. The two may, of course, be related. The two may be, in some cases, inseparable, but not always, because we talked, for example, about cases where pain can be given a positive value, right? A woman having a natural childbirth, a martyr being tortured to their death, which they infuse with meaning because now they know they're going to go to heaven, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. We have life, we have suffering, and two categories of suffering. We have, the colors are doing funny things for me here. We said we had agency.
Oh, yeah.
And again, agency meant two different things, or could mean two different things. Agency could mean either, how did we put it? We put choice, or what was the other one that we had? Action, I think, yes. Meaning sometimes agency is a matter of doing something, and sometimes agency is the ability to choose. Again, those often come hand in hand, right? When you act, you presumably act because you have a choice to make, but not always. Sometimes a person acts not of their free will. Sometimes a person acts, they do something accidentally. The fact that they have acted sometimes means they're responsible, even if it's accidental, right? The legal system often holds somebody responsible, even if something is accidental, even if they didn't mean to do what they just did. Choice, on the other hand, is something deliberate, something that you have the ability to choose. You might choose not to do something. Your choice might be inaction or withdrawal, which of course we're going to talk a great deal about. But those are, so these are two elements of agency that, again, sometimes or often overlap, but not always. And the last category that we had was dignity, which of course is the title of the class. And what we said last time about dignity is that dignity is an awfully slippery, did we say this? I think we said this. The dignity is an awfully slippery subject. Did we talk about this? Did we? Okay. Let me just say it again quickly. When we talk about dignity, maybe we didn't talk about it. Dignity is actually quite hard to define. And we did, yeah, I think we did do a little of this. What is dignity? We said dignity is minimally has to do with one's sense of self. Dignity has to do with the way that we perceive ourselves, and it may be equally important, maybe sometimes even more important, the way other people perceive us, or the way that we are perceived relative to other people in our society. Okay, dignity is often a matter of social status. It's a matter of a certain comportment or a certain degree of recognition by other people. What we also said is that dignity is, whatever dignity is, it's important to distinguishing dignity and life, which is why I've put them here in opposite corners of the square. Because when we talk about dignity as a value in medical ethics decision-making, we almost always mean dignity as opposed to something that is life. That's not to say that dignity and life don't go together, or that they can't go together, but it's saying that when we bring dignity into the discussion, it's as an additional and sometimes countervailing factor to life. Somebody might decide that, and of course this is, our life is important to us, and therefore therefore when you acknowledge somebody's life, you are giving them dignity. But typically when we talk about dignity, we're talking about some aspect of the person's self that goes beyond the basic fact of their being alive. Okay? So if you notice, just the way that I've arranged them in this square, I don't want to make too much of it, but agency and dignity are both things that are, life and agency are both things that are objective, in the sense that these are things that are, I don't want to put it that way. let me not make too much of this square. Let's see how this square works for us in terms of the way that we're analyzing the sources that we're talking about. What we said last time is, hold on a second. I don't mean to be too obsessive about the color. Those of you who've been with me for a while know that I'm a very visual teacher and get very particular about colors. For some reason, I decided to color my word life blue. There we go. Now it's all in orange, which means nothing other than it's all in the same color. When I want to use different color, I will. Let's use a different color right now, because the topic of this sugya, of this kind of halachic issue that we're following through, is different than what we're going to talk about next class. Okay, so let's do this again in a different color. The issue that we're talking about now is, what care must we provide to a terminally ill patient? Terminally ill is not quite the right word. In fact, I had a better word right here. To a dying patient. Let's put it that way. That's the question on the board. And we're going to talk about that in light of the different values that we have here. Okay. What we're going to talk about next class, I hope we'll get to finish this topic this class, and we'll get to the other topic by next class, is what kind of care are we allowed to provide to a dying patient? And to what extent does the patient get to choose the kind of care that they want? I know that sounds like the same issue, but we're going to see that it's a subtly different issue and involves some different discussions and some different sources. But this is the issue that we want to address right now. What kind of care do we, as third parties or second parties, have a responsibility to provide to a dying patient? Okay, and locked into this, of course, or intertwined with this, of course, is the question of what kind of care can we not provide if we so choose? Where we ended our discussion last time, after we discussed these four different elements, was, let me share the sources with you now. You see the sources? Okay. We talked about the passage from the Talmud in Nidarim and Rabbi Nisim of Gerona's commentary on that. We said that the Talmud says, anyone who doesn't visit the sick neither prays that he should, anyone who visits the sick causes him to live, and anyone who does not visit the sick causes him to die. Talmud was a little stymied by this and said, what do you mean? If I don't visit him, I'm not doing anything. Why am I causing the patient to die? Rather, it said, anyone who doesn't visit the sick neither prays that he should live nor prays that he should die. Now, that's a kind of strange reinterpretation of that statement, of Rav Dimi's statement at the beginning of this passage. It implies that there are, in fact, three plausible things that you could do to a dying patient. You could pray that they could live, you could pray that they could die, or you could do nothing. What the Talmud implies is that doing nothing is the worst thing of all. In other words, when we look at these passages, what we see, again, in terms of this square, is that agency is a critical component. And we think about, when we think about the care that we have to provide to a dying patient, one of the critical things that we have to do is something. We have to actually choose what's best for them. We have to choose it and we have to act. And therefore, agency is the concept that is coming into play here. It's saying this is an obligation that you have. That in of itself is an important statement to make. And in fact, this is an area where Halakhah is very much in line with modern medical ethics. Modern medical ethics assumes that healthcare providers have an obligation to their patients. In other words, it's not simply that the patient is there and we can choose to treat them or not treat them. Once they are in our care, once they're in a context where we all have relationships with one another and responsibilities to one another, it's the healthcare provider's responsibility to provide the best possible care for that patient. I know that sounds self-evident, but as we go forward, we're going to see that it's not. There are contexts where you could have said, no, they're on their own, or I don't have a responsibility to deal with X or Y or Z. or even where the responsibility of the healthcare provider, of the doctor, of the nurse, of the family member, dictates a certain kind of course of action as opposed to another. Okay, so again, Halakhah and modern medical ethics both presume an ethic of responsibility toward the patients. Okay, whether there's another component here we're going to have to address, but that's at least the beginning point of our analysis. Okay. Back to the sources. What I want to do now is move from these sources, which, as I said last time, are really the natural beginning to the sugya, the beginning in the sense that everybody who addresses this halachic issue begins with these sources. Okay, it's not that halakha gives us a kind of linear path through the Talmud. The Talmud is, if you're familiar with the Talmud, it's a famously disorganized document, stream of consciousness, sources coming from here and there. In order to create a sense of unity, you have to be a master of many, of just simply a vast array of texts. But anybody who addresses this issue begins with these sources. This is kind of an agreed upon starting point. We're going to shift now to the Middle Ages and to a different set of sources that address a different kind of question, more directly the kind of question that we put on the board, which is what kind of care are we required to provide to a dying patient? Somebody want to read? Okay, go ahead.
Where should I read?
From Sefer Hasidim.
Okay, Sefer Hasidim. One may not prevent a person from dying more quickly. For example, if there was a gases?
Goses.
Goses in Hebrew, of course. Okay. Where there was a goses close to the house of a wood chopper and his soul cannot depart, we remove the wood chopper from there. And one may not place salt on his tongue so that he doesn't die. And if a person were a goses, saying that he cannot die until they place him in a different location, one may not move him from there.
Okay. The truth is the translation, I'm wondering how this got translated this way. One may not, I want to change this actually, cause a person. So if you look at the Hebrew, there's a double negative in the Hebrew. When that cause, prevent a person, oh, I see what, hold on. One may not, here's the problem. One may not prevent a person from not dying more quickly. That's how it should read. Okay. In other words, you can prevent a person from dying. Okay. For example, okay, here are the examples. If a person has a goses, what's a goses? Somebody who's in the last throes of life. Okay. Classically, this was defined. We just had a power outage again, but I will see what I can do here in terms of
We can still hear you perfectly.
You can you still hear me?
Okay. We can hear you perfectly, yeah.
Okay, here we go. If somebody's a goses, it means that they are, sorry, hold on a second. If somebody is a goses, it means they're in the last throes of life, meaning, classically, this was defined as somebody who's in the last 3 days of life. Whether it means the same thing nowadays, of course, the time frame of end-of-life care is very different now than it was then. But that's classically how it's defined. If somebody's close to the house of a wood chopper and his soul cannot depart, why can his soul not depart? Because he hears the sound of the wood chopper, and somehow the stimulus of hearing the sound is preventing him from dying. Whether that's true or not, medically, psychologically, I don't know. One time I taught this and we were talking about the sound of a wood chopper, and suddenly somebody outside started a leaf blower. If you had a leaf blower going on in the background, I could imagine that would prevent you from doing anything, even thinking straight, much less dying. We remove the wood chopper from there. What's the point? We're obligated to create a situation where nature can take its course, okay? That's in terms of an obligation. You have to actually take away that stimulus to allow the person to die. And one may not place salt on his tongue so that he doesn't die. Similarly, you cannot create a stimulus for the person to prevent the person from dying. However, if a person were a gosei saying he cannot die until they place him in a different location, one may not move him from there. Okay? What's the point here?
You can't encourage dying. You can just remove obstacles that prevent it.
Thank you. You can't encourage dying, but you have to remove. And you kind of create obstacles for death. Okay. That's okay. You still see my screen? Yes. You still see the sources? Okay. That seems to be the point of the Sefer Hasidim. Who is the Sefer Hasidim, by the way? Sefer Hasidim is Rabbi Yehuda ben Shmuel of Regensburg, again, a medieval German scholar from the medieval German Hasidic movement. Okay, no relation to the modern Hasidic movement. Certain overlap in terms of philosophy, in terms of having a kind of ethic of asceticism, an ethic of piety. But a different movement. This book is therefore a compilation of more of customs than of laws from the medieval German pietist movement, the medieval German Hasidic movement. This becomes an important source because as we go forward, we're going to see that it does not necessarily line up perfectly with other things that we know about end-of-life care. Let's shift now to Spain, to northern Christian Spain, and the Ramban, who quotes an earlier rabbinic passage about the same state of being, but a different set of halachot. Okay, let me read this. I'm just going to read to save time in case the paragraph goes out again and we have to stop. It is taught in Evel Rabbati. Evel Rabbati is one of the rabbinic texts that addresses the laws of mourning and the laws of end-of-life care. A goses is considered to be alive for all matters. One may not bind his cheeks, anoint or wash him, or stop up his orifices, nor may one remove a pillow from underneath him. Nor may one close his eyes until his soul departs. And anyone who closes his eyes as his soul is departing is considered to be a murderer. What's the basic idea here? All of these things are things that we don't generally associate with end-of-life care. What are they? Any of these kinds of activities?
Preparation for death. I mean, for burial.
Preparation for death. Yeah. In fact, some of these things are things that you would do for a dead person. Okay. In other words, Evel Rabbati is stressing that a goses is not dead. The life force that they have is still very much life. And therefore, you're not allowed to treat this person as if they're dead or start making preparations for their death. In fact, the way this is traditionally understood, again, one could quibble with the details here, the way this is traditionally understood is that when a person is in the last throes of their life, you interact with them as minimally as possible to the point of not even touching them when it's not medically necessary to prevent the person possibly causing them to die. In other words, here, there's an ethic of withdrawal. Here, there's an ethic of not wanting to intervene lest we hasten their death. So we have a responsibility on the one hand to let nature take its course. On the other hand, a responsibility not to hasten a person's death because of the infinite value of a human life. Okay? Here are the two classical sources. They're going to be the basis of the next few sources that we're going to see. Because now the question is, how active or passive can you be? How active can you be, and how passive do you have to be in terms of treating somebody who is in the last throes of life? These sources are brought together a few hundred years later. This is how halachic sugya works, right? Somebody says something in Germany, says something in Spain, and now we have a later early modern scholar, late medieval, early modern scholar around the time of the Renaissance in Italy, right? So you have kind of this, the way a friend of mine put it, this reads like the notes of an intergenerational meeting, right? Where one person says one thing, the other person says another thing, and they come together and says, okay, based on what you're saying, here's what I get. Here we have Rabbi Yeshua Boaz, famous for a number of other works that he's written, including important indices on the page of the Talmud. If you're learning Daf Yomi, you're using some of his helpful footnotes on the side. He says as follows: from here it would seem, okay, from this passage in the Ramban, he's commenting on this. He says, from here it would seem that one should prohibit that which some people do when the patient is a goses, to remove the pillow from underneath him, saying that there are feathers which prevent the soul from departing. Okay, he says there are people who would say if there are certain kinds of bird feathers in the pillow, that's preventing the person from departing. The Shiltei Giborim says, Rabbi Yeshua Boaz says, you know what? You shouldn't remove the pillow, because when you're removing the pillow, what are you doing? You're causing the person to die, right? You're actively hastening their death. And he says, and several times I've strongly objected to this to no avail. People keep doing it. A statement of rabbinic impotence, where you keep saying, no, you really shouldn't be doing this, and nobody pays any attention. When we should say, and we'll probably say again, that in these kinds of areas, there's an enormous force to cultural factors that come into play. Clearly, this was a very strong cultural norm that people had of removing this pillow, or assuming this pillow was somehow preventing the person from dying, and they wanted to remove it. Rabbi Yeshua Boaz says, you can't do that, because by doing so, you're hastening his death. After a few years, I found support for my position in the Sefer HaChasidim number 723. And if one were a gosei saying he cannot die until they place him in a different location, one may not move him from there. Okay, he says, look, what's this issue of the pillow comparable to? This issue of the pillow is comparable to what the Sefer HaChasidim said about not moving him to another location. Just like you can't move him to another location. If he says that this room is too hot, I can't die, I feel, or this room is too cold, you can't move them to a different location because that would be actively hastening their death. So to here, he says that would be the same would be true by removing this pillow with this kind of strange metaphysical quality of bird feathers keeping them alive. In truth, the Sefer HaChasidim's words require analysis. For at first he wrote, therefore was a gosei close to the house of a woodchopper, and his soul cannot depart. We remove the woodchopper from there, which seems to be the opposite of what he wrote afterwards. Okay? In other words, now, Rabbi Yeshua Boaz is saying, wait a second, it's not clear what exactly distinction is between the two things, the two categories of actions that the Sefer HaChasidim mentioned. On the one hand, he says you have to remove the wood chopper and not place salt on his tongue. On the other hand, you're not allowed to move him to a different location, right? Well, some things, he says, you have to do, right, to let nature take its course. And in the other case, he says, no, doing that would hasten the person's death. But what's the difference between these? And if I have a third kind of case, like removing this pillow with bird feathers, is it like the wood chopper, or is it like moving them to a different place? You following me so far? I realize these are strange assumptions, right? The wood chopper, the salt on the tongue, that kind of makes sense. Maybe moving to a different location. The bird feathers is kind of weird, right? We don't really have a sense of what kinds of assumptions they're making about why this worked, or whether this was physical or metaphysical or psychological. We don't really understand. What we have here structurally, though, is a classic kind of legal analysis. I know that case A is, or action A is permitted or maybe even required. Action B is prohibited, and now I have action C. Is action C more similar to action A or action B? This is the basic structure of any legal question, right? You can use that to analyze any legal question. You can open this, a Supreme Court decision from the U.S. Supreme Court, and invariably, somewhere buried in the text is an analysis that says, well, we have precedent A and precedent B, and is this case C more similar to A or B? Right? Now, obviously, there's a lot more to it than that, but that's the basic structure of any kind of legal question. And that's what he's asking here. What is the difference, and how should I know whether the pillow with the bird feathers is more similar to A or B? However, one can resolve this by saying it's forbidden to do something that prevents a gosei from dying sooner, such as chopping wood to prevent the soul from leaving, or putting salt on his tongue so he doesn't die quickly. All of these are forbidden, as is implied there. And in such cases, when we remove the cause of his not dying, but it is forbidden to do something that will cause him to die sooner, and therefore it's forbidden to move him from his place to a different location so that his soul departs. And therefore it is also forbidden to place the keys of the synagogue under the head of the gosei, for he should die quickly, for this too hastens his death. Now he brings another case. Again, strange. There was a custom, apparently, again, the force of custom, of putting the keys of the synagogue under the person's pillows so that they die faster. He says you can't do that either, because that hastens their death. Again, it's not simply a matter of action versus inaction. What's the distinction he's making here? It's preventing nature from taking its course to causing them to die sooner. Okay, so that's the distinction that he makes explicit, even though the Sefer HaChasidim didn't say it quite so clearly. According to this, if there's something that prevents his soul from departing, there's no prohibition to remove it. For in doing so, one is not snuffing out the candle or doing an act at all. So in the end, he concludes you actually can remove the pillow with the bird feathers because the pillow with the bird feathers ostensibly is preventing the person from dying. Doing so, you're not actively causing them to die. But it seems that placing something on the goses or moving him from place to place so that his soul departs more quickly is prohibited. For one is snuffing out the candle. Okay. That's his conclusion. Okay, you with me so far? How would we sum this up? How would we articulate the distinction that he makes between these two sets of things, one of which you cannot do and have to remove if it's there, like the sound of the wood chopper or the salt on the tongue, versus those things that you can't do, like moving them to a different location or placing the keys under their pillow. Oh, one thing. A friend of mine, where is this? I was going to show you this book anyway, so I might as well show it to you now. Here it is. A friend of mine by the name of Rabbi Jason Wiener wrote this book, A Jewish Guide to Practical Medical Decision-Making. Excellent, excellent guide. He's really very thorough. And he's a chaplain in Cedar Sinai Hospital in Los Angeles. And he relays some interesting stories from his days as a chaplain, including one where they take, he said he's seen this multiple times, where they take a chicken and put it on the stomach of a person who's dying so that they die faster. And the first time he heard about this, he could not understand what it was. And then he heard about it again. He's like, oh, I see this is a thing. So lest we think that in the modern era, we are so much more advanced and less superstitious, not so. How would you articulate the distinction between these two different kinds of actions, one of which we can't do and one of which we can or have to? It's important to articulate it because, of course, what are we interested in? What are we going to substitute for putting the keys under the pillow or stopping the wood chopper?
Pain medication.
Pain medication.
An end of life or nutrition.
Intravenous nutrition, antibiotics, dialysis, ventilation. If a person is having trouble breathing, do we have to intubate them? If a person doesn't want to be on a ventilator, can we extubate them? These are complicated questions that seem to fit into these two categories, but we have to articulate the difference between them in order to be able to apply it. What's the difference then between these two categories? How would you articulate it? What kind of terminology would you use to put on each of these categories?
I would say we have to remove obstacles to letting nature take its course, but we can't do anything that would cause that to happen quicker.
Okay. What counts as an obstacle? That's an interesting word. You use the word obstacle. What counts as an obstacle?
I would, if I'm thinking really practical, because I'm doing a healthcare proxy right now with my husband, we're talking about machines.
Okay, a machine strikes you as an obstacle. No, they don't have machines here, but why does machine, what about a machine suggests an obstacle to letting nature take its course? A machine is by nature something artificial, right? A machine is something that is other, it's not human, right? It's not natural. Think about letting nature take its course. Well, a machine is not part of nature. A machine is something artificial that we have invented, that we have put into the picture actively. So one way of framing this, actually a very common way of framing this distinction, is to say that something is natural versus artificial. If I introduce something artificial into the system that's preventing them from dying, that's an obstacle to them from dying, then I have to remove it, or I'm able to remove it. If there's something artificial that would hasten their death, then I can't do that. Okay? In other words, it's removing the artificial things and letting nature take its course. That distinction between natural and artificial seems to be, or is commonly used to frame these two categories. We might come up with another distinction, but that's a working distinction for now. Okay. I don't want to, I put the Shulchan Aruch here. The Shulchan Aruch, again, is the kind of definitive code of Jewish law at the end of the Middle Ages. And this is what we look to when we need kind of a decisive ruling among all of these different voices during the Middle Ages. But I'm going to jump ahead now to the 20th century, okay? Because this is where, this is the time period when these kinds of issues come to the fore. 20th century, of course, is when you have the first significant kind of mechanical or artificial end-of-life care, beginning with the invention of the ventilator, actually the beginning of the 20th century, earlier than most people think. And since then, of course, we've developed many other kinds of technologies, many other kinds of medicines, many other kinds of treatments that enable us to sustain life far longer than we would have been able in an earlier era. Okay. We're now in the 1970s, or late 60s, early 70s. The Igrod Moshe, or Moshe Feinstein, was the preeminent posek, the preeminent halachic authority in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. He died in 1986. He's somebody who was respected really across the spectrum of Judaism, certainly within the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox community, but somebody who spoke with a great deal of authority even to the conservative and reform movements. I should mention that all the 20th century authorities on this on the source sheet are Orthodox, for the simple reason right now that there's not a lot of difference between the Orthodox and conservative approaches to this issue, with one not huge caveat, which hopefully we'll address, but probably not today. And eventually we will talk maybe a little more about the relationship between the Orthodox and conservative movements on the one hand, and medical ethics and the Reform and Reconstructionist communities on the other hand. Moshe Feinstein addresses this issue of end-of-life care in an interesting context in his first responsum on the issue of heart transplants. Heart transplants, of course, became a viable medical procedure in the end of the 1960s. They were then basically put in, there was basically a moratorium on them throughout the 1970s until they developed anti-rejection drugs that enabled the heart to not be rejected in the recipient. But here he's addressing the question of the donor. And the question, of course, of, first of all, when is the donor actually dead, such that we can remove their internal organs or harvest their internal organs for transplant? But also, and this is the issue he's addressing here, what were we allowed to do to sustain a patient until they were ready to have their organs harvested? In other words, if we see somebody as a potential organ donor, but we assess that they're still alive, they're not dead yet, even by a standard of brain death, what kind of treatment can we provide? What kind of treatment are we obligated to provide for them while we are waiting for nature to take its course? So here he goes. On the practice of artificially sustaining potential organ donors past the point when they would normally live until the transplant is ready to be performed. Okay, you might want to keep the patient alive for longer than would otherwise happen, because you want the transplant to happen at a certain point in time. What's the key issue here? Why do you need to time it so carefully? In order for the transplant to be successful, the organs have to be very fresh. Not to be a little crass about it. As soon as the patient dies, there's a very, very small window of time, really a matter of minutes, before the organs start to decay beyond the point where they'll be viable in the transplant recipient. And therefore, the transplant does have to be timed very carefully. If you have a patient who's a potential transplant donor, and you want to keep them alive for longer than normal, are you allowed to do that? That's his question right here. In my humble opinion, he says, it seems that it's not. It seems that since it's not being done to heal him, but rather only to lengthen his life in the short term, if the short-term life that he lives by artificial means will be painful, then it's forbidden. Okay? So there's an obvious value to having the transplant be viable, because of course, saving the recipient's life is a really a really important issue. You want to be able to save their life. And therefore you say, okay, well, in order to save their life, I will make a small sacrifice and extend this person's life beyond what would normally happen. Says Rav Moshe Feinstein, that's not okay. You're not allowed to artificially lengthen their life. Why or in what scenario? If they're in pain. If by sustaining them past the point they would normally live, you are extending their suffering, then you're not allowed to do that, even at the cost of not being able to perform the transplant and saving the recipient's life. For it seems that this is the reason that one may remove something that's preventing the soul from departing when it doesn't involve an affirmative act to prevent suffering. In other words, why, when a person can't die because of the wood chopper, or why, when a person can't die because there's salt on their tongue, why are you allowed to, or actually you have to remove those things? Because they're suffering. Now, how did he put suffering into the picture? Where did we see suffering in this whole discussion? We saw suffering way back when we read this story about Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Somebody asked in the chat column, what's the relationship between Rabbi Yehuda ben Samuel of Regensburg and Rabbi Yehuda the Prince? Rabbi Yehuda the Prince is in the rabbinic period, okay, the 2nd century CE. And so he and Rabbi Judah of Regensburg is about 1,000 years later. Okay, no relation at all other than with being Jewish and having the name Judah. We saw the issue of suffering here, but the Sefer HaChasidim and the Ramban did not mention suffering at all. Where's Rav Moshe Feinstein suddenly schlepping in the concept of suffering as a way of adjudicating whether or not you can take action? So he says that must have been the reason. He says that must be the subtext. He says, I'm reading between the lines. Well, you could say that, but you could also challenge him, right? Who gives you the right to read between the lines and say that's what it must mean? He explains as follows. For if it were permissible to lengthen an individual's life artificially, even when he is suffering, why would it be permissible to remove something that's preventing the soul from departing? On the contrary, one would have to bring things that prevent the soul from departing so that he would live a bit longer. In other words, he says, look, life is a really important value in Judaism. In general, what do we assume? You do whatever you can to lengthen a person's life. How do we know that for sure? From a halachic perspective. What tells us the value of a life in Judaism? Or where does Halakhah convey to us the value of a life?
You can violate anything like Shabbos in order to prolong life.
You can violate Shabbat in order to save somebody's life. Not only can you, you must. Not only must you, but the Rambam, Maimonides, says when there's somebody in a situation where their life is being threatened, we do not delegate the violation of Shabbat to he says women and slaves, to the lower caste of society. We have it done by the most prominent member of society to show how important it is. And basically, aside from the big 3 prohibitions, idolatry, incest, and of course murder, anything is trumped by saving a life. That tells you the value of life in Judaism. Why wouldn't you do whatever you can to lengthen somebody's life? Says Rav Moshe Feinstein, there must be some countervailing factor. That's the only reason that you have to let nature take its course, and you should do things to allow nature to take their course by removing artificial obstacles to their dying. And therefore, he says that only the only countervailing factor where that could be there is suffering. So if we go back to our whiteboard, effectively, what does Rav Moshe Feinstein do? He says, look at this whiteboard. What care must we provide to a dying patient? He draws a line between life and suffering. And he says as follows. On this side of the line is, in order to, when you think about doing things for somebody's life, what do you have? It's not letting me do this. Hold on a second. Or actually, before we put in any text, he says it's not letting me put in text anyway. So we might as well just draw the line here. What do I mean by this line? Life and suffering are the 2 countervailing values that inform what care we must provide to a dying patient. There are some kinds of care that we have to provide or some kinds of care that we may not remove because they are sustaining a person's life. There are other kinds of care that we must remove and cannot provide because they're prolonging somebody's suffering. And here by suffering, what does he likely mean? Which, if we had to pick one category of suffering, what would we be talking about here?
Physical.
Physical. Why physical? Why would you say it's physical pain? The kind of patient we're talking about is probably not conscious. Okay, if we're talking about a candidate for to be an organ donor, probably the person is not conscious. In fact, usually, why is somebody an organ donor? Because they've sustained some sort of serious head injury that puts them in a situation where they're dying, but their body is still intact. That's the most common scenario in which somebody is a potential organ donor, and therefore they're almost certainly not conscious. Okay, so it's physical pain versus life. These are the two countervailing factors that inform this, and this is the line between them. We're going to have to decide what goes on this side of the line and what goes on that side of the line. Okay. Okay, let's go back to the source sheet, because I know that at least somebody, one of you, is thinking, well, wait a second, if they're not conscious, then how could they be suffering? And regarding that which doctors say, that he no longer feels pain, again, because the person is probably not conscious, one should not believe them, for it's possible they aren't capable of knowing this. Here's something that comes up every so often when you learn the Halakhah relating to medical care. Doctors and rabbis sometimes go head to head in terms of who is the most authoritative. And when you read rabbinic sources or halachic sources, sometimes they get a little snarky, right? They say, do those doctors really know what they're talking about? Really, come on. In this very responsum, Rav Moshe Feinstein actually levels some very serious accusations against the doctors who performed the first human heart-to-heart transplant in South Africa. He accuses them of being liars, he accuses them of being murderers, on and on and on. And actually, he ends up kind of being right, because they did actually not testify honestly as to how they harvested the heart that they took from Denise Darval, who was the first heart donor. So again, the rabbis are not always wrong, but they do get a little snarky even when they're not right. Well, is he right? Do we know whether a patient who's conscious is feeling pain or not? How do we know? Nowadays, you might be able to do an MRI and actually see what's going on in their brain and whether they're feeling pain. But one of the things they've discovered in the past, say, 20 years in terms of studying people who are in persistent vegetative states, people who are in comatose states, is there's actually a lot more going on in the brain than we think. People who have woken up from comas, for example, can recognize voices of people that they did not know before they were comatose. So there's clearly some sort of cognition going on, some sort of sensory perception going on, even though the person is not conscious. We simply don't know what's going on in the brain and whether this person is feeling pain. And therefore, this is the important point, Rav Moshe Feinstein says you cannot assume that the person is not in pain. The assumption of pain, or the question as to whether the person might be in pain, supersedes the desire to keep them alive for the value of their organs. Okay, that gives you a sense of how much he values suffering, or how much he sees suffering as a countervailing force to life, to the point where you're really not allowed to keep them alive for longer than they naturally would, because you're extending their suffering. Okay, this is the most the most, I don't know, extreme is not the right word, the most insistent articulation of the value that suffering has in these kinds of questions in modern halachic literature. He's really quite emphatic about the way that suffering is something that you're simply not allowed to sustain, even though you're extending the person's life and you may be saving somebody else's life in the process. You're not allowed to extend somebody's suffering for the value of life. Okay, questions, comments before we do one or maybe two more sources?
So,
yeah.
So you're saying that he assumes suffering even in cases where somebody obviously can't say that they're in pain.
Yeah, and now, of course, this is an issue that we'll talk about not extensively, but briefly in our next discussion, when we talk about decision making for somebody who may not be competent to make a decision, somebody who's comatose, somebody who can't articulate their needs. But yes, he says that you have to assume that the person could be suffering, and if they can't articulate it, you can't assume that they're not suffering.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to see Rav Moshe Feinstein again in a minute, but I want to just make sure to get this in before we finish, that we only have two sources to see next time. The Minchat Shlomo by Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was roughly contemporary with Rav Moshe Feinstein. He lived in Israel. Moshe Feinstein lived in Russia and then in the United States. He's considered to be the preeminent halachic authority in Israel in the mid to late 20th century. And again, somebody whose halachic authority was respected across Israeli society. He was himself identified as ultra-Orthodox. Nonetheless, he was considered to be an important posek for all sorts of questions about halachic observance in the army, even though, again, ultra-Orthodox don't go to the army. He created a sense of a certain halachic norm that runs the gamut of Israeli society. For example, he ruled that all of Jerusalem, not only the old city of Jerusalem, but all of Jerusalem celebrates the second day of Purim, Shushan Purim, and that's how it became the norm. Even though, of course, Jerusalem is now a sprawling city far beyond the walls of the traditional old city. I was actually at his funeral when he died in 1995, and 400,000 people packed the streets of Jerusalem. It was a remarkable sight. He says as follows on this issue. Many people are uncertain about the issue of treating a goses. There are those who rule that one must violate Shabbat to save even a moment of life, just as one must violate even a moment to save one's life, i.e. to extend the life of somebody who will certainly die. So too, one must force a dying patient to accept treatment, since he is not master over his own life, such that he has the right to forfeit even one moment. Okay, so here's the question that we're going to be addressing more explicitly next time, which is, let's say the patient does have agency. The person can articulate their needs or their wants or the course of treatment that they want. To what extent must you accede to their wishes? That's going to be the issue that we get into more next time. So he says, well, there are those people who say you completely ignore them, you do whatever you can to keep them alive, and you completely override their wishes. Why? Why shouldn't the patient get to decide what he or she wants? Person is not master over his own life. Again, a point that we'll leave for longer discussion next time. The assumption in Judaism is not that you have full license to live or die as you wish. Your life is given to you by God, and therefore you have a responsibility to protect it and a responsibility to sustain it. And therefore, we should do whatever it takes to sustain your life, even overriding the patient's wishes. But it seems to me, he says, that if the patient is experiencing severe pains and afflictions, or even intense psychological pain, here comes mental anguish, not just physical pain, then one must provide him with food and oxygen, even against his will. But one may withhold the medications that are causing the patient pain by prolonging his life if he so desires. So here, the point is made explicitly, and again, we'll see this in Rav Moshe Feinstein next week as well, where he distinguishes between two different kinds of treatment and puts them on opposite sides of the line that we just drew before. Okay, let's go back to our whiteboard. He says as follows. What am I going to put on the side of the line? What goes on the life side? What do I need to do to sustain somebody's life? Things that are natural. Any natural kind of treatment needs to be done in order to sustain somebody's life. And there, he says, we'll have to tweak this a little bit next week. He says you even do it against the person's will. How much against the person's will? Again, a discussion for next time. But he says, on the side of suffering, if they are suffering extensively, you do not have to provide and may withdraw what other kinds of treatment? Anything artificial. Okay. In other words, he's taking the distinction, the natural artificial distinction that we made before, and apportioning it to these two sides of the line. When it's a matter of providing natural treatment, you do whatever you have to do to sustain their life. However, if they're suffering, you do not provide and may withdraw artificial treatments. What's natural? What's artificial? What does he put in each category? So let's just list what he says, and we'll discuss this more in more detail next time. He says, natural, he says, what do you have to provide? Food, liquids, and oxygen. Those he deems to be natural treatments. Artificial, what does he say? Back in the text again.
Medicine.
Medicine.
Medication.
Okay. He says medicine is something that is artificial. That's not, it's something that we have imposed, that we have introduced, that's sustaining the person's life artificially, and therefore you may withdraw that. Okay. Let's leave the chart this way. And next time we will continue our discussion of patient agency, what kinds of choices we allow them to make, and what kinds of priorities we allow the patient to set. And then we'll bring it all back to the issue of dignity and talk about how these three different elements, agency, life, and suffering, help us create a sense of dignity within this particular halachic question.
Danny, I just wanted to ask, I'm sorry I couldn't come earlier. Is there an agreement about what constitutes food? Because
no. Okay, so we're going to talk about that next time. We're going to talk first of all about different kinds of feeding, both intravenous or artificial and manual feeding, and also what exactly constitutes nutrition. What's the goal of providing nutrition? Okay,
thanks.
but we'll leave that for next time. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all next week.
Thank you, Rabbi Reifman. This was an interesting class, and I'm looking forward to the next one next week. And thank you also to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We continue our full program this evening at 8 p.m. with the final session. This was extended on Imagining King David and the Babylonian Talmud with Rabbi David Silber. And as always, we have many more classes happening right now. You can find out more information on our website as well as the registration links. It's www.drisha.org/classes. You can also watch live at drisha.org/live. Thank you again for the opportunity to learn with you, Rabbi Reifman. And thanks again to everyone who attended. We hope to see you soon at one of our other classes at Drisha. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Right.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.